And while you're doing that, let me tell you, this is the book of promise. You know, no matter which way you look at it, sadly, some people somehow in the midst of it all lose sight of God's promise, but this book is a book full of promise. I mean, if you look at it eternally, if you look at it various stories and various individuals and people within, if you look at all that's available through Christ, it's just full of promise. And not only promise, but fulfilled promise. But man, are there some fights to see the promise fulfilled? You know something? Your life is filled with promise. I have no doubt that God has promise written across your life, across the various things that he's birthed in your spirit. I believe that God's promise, this promise, and various things that God out of his word or in line with his word has spoken into your own home and family, within your friendships and your relationships and networks, your health, your own personal journey and your divine purpose. I believe that God's promise is all over it. But man, can't it be a fight sometime to see the promise fulfilled? Here in Joshua chapter 1, Joshua is a man who God gives an incredible promise. It says in verse 2 that Moses was dead, and the Lord said to Joshua, "Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving to them, the children of Israel." God's promise for the people of Israel. And that is a land, that land. It says, every place that the sole of your feet will tread upon, I give you, as I said to Moses. Listen to that promise. Every place you put the sole of your feet, I'm going to give it to you. It goes on there. It says, verse 4, from the wilderness and the Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittite to the great sea, towards you going down of the sun, shall be your territory. And you know something? Whenever the promise of God involves you gaining territory, gaining ground, making progress, getting some momentum, you can almost guarantee right there that that won't come without a challenge, that it won't come without a fight. There's no mention of a fight though. All it says is every place you put the sole of your feet, I'm going to give it to you. No battles mentioned, no challenges mentioned, just this incredible promise. Maybe the very next verse, verse 6. You know, perhaps in all of that wonderful promise, Joshua is asking why the Lord next says, be strong and have courage. And then in verse 7, he says, be strong and very courageous. And in verse 9, be strong and have courage. No mention of a battle, just every place you put the sole of your feet. He described the land between the sea and the mountain, between the river and the desert. All of that promise was there. But be strong and take courage. But then when you get to chapter 12, and I love this. I love it because I can identify with it. You start hearing things that weren't mentioned. Like in verse 7, it says, and these are the kings of the country which Joshua and the children of Israel conquered. As it goes on and describes the land between the desert and the ocean and the mountain and the river. It describes kings that had to be conquered. No mention of that when it was just every place you put the sole of your feet, I'm going to give it to you. You know, oftentimes God births something in your spirit. Moses, the Lord says, I want you to let my people go. I'm going to use you to bring them out from bondage. No mention of the next 40 years in a barren place, in the wilderness. No mention of that whatsoever. No mention of, oh, by the way, this is going to take a little while. Just, I'm going to use you. You see, God's promise, oftentimes, you get the promise of birth in your spirit, but what many people aren't prepared for is the battle or the challenge or the fight to see the promise fulfilled. So you think, okay, well, every place, maybe he had a couple of things to conquer. He had a couple of things to conquer, all right. These are the kings he had to conquer. Verse 9, there was the king of Jericho, one. Everyone here's had at least one battle. The king of Jarmuth, one. Oh, and the king of Lachish, one. Oh, and the king of Eglon, one. And the king of Giza, this Giza was another one. And the king of Hamath, one. The king of Arad, one. King of Libnah, one. King of Adullam, one. King of Makkedah, king of Bethel, king of Tappuah, king of Lasharon, king of Madon, king of Hazor, the king of Shamron, Meron, king of Ashaph, the king of Taanach, the king of Megiddo, the king of Kadesh, the king of Jochanan, in Carmel one, the king of Dor, even the Dor had a king. In the heights of Dor, one the king, and the people of Gilgal one, the king of Tisra one, all the kings, 31. Everywhere you put the sole of your feet, I'm going to give it to you. But no mention of the 31 kings that stood between Joshua and God's people and the promise. I want to encourage you this morning to fight to the finish. I want you to understand that God's promise is on your life. You know, God gave us a promise when we started this church 27 years ago today. And I think about the dream, and I think about the fact we really didn't know what it was going to look like. I can remember back at that time, literally in my car going around and knocking on doors, looking for somewhere to have church. I can remember going to little community centers and into schools and asking the principal if we could start a church. And we found a little school which no longer is there, up the Windsor Road or down the Windsor Road in Northmead, roughly, Borkham Hills technically, Borkham Hills Public School, and we started. And we started with a friend's little encouragement. One of my friends, still my friend today, says, if you start a church in Borkham Hills, I know so many people who will come. And I don't know whether even one of the people that he said would come, ever did come. And the other thing was, this funny thing how God can use anything, but there was a car salesman out this way in those days, and he used to go on TV and shout at people. And his theme, as if you like, was just up the Windsor Road from Borkham Hills and let me do it right for you. And, not about him. But Borkham Hills back then, 27 years ago, a lot of it was really fields and paddocks where we are now. This certainly was just a field and a paddock, and it was several kilometers back that way as well. And so it was amazing to hear that this business was actually the biggest Holden car dealership in Australia. Out in this edge of nowhere, Borkham Hills. And I felt quickened in my spirit that if somebody can start the biggest Holden dealership in Australia in Borkham Hills, imagine what God could do there. And with that little promise, we stepped out. What a journey, what a story, what an adventure. I guess one day when it comes to the story of church history in Australia, that this will get some little mention of it somewhere. What an amazing journey. But hadn't there been some incredible challenges along the way? Don't mention that when you're 29-year-old stepping out. For you, you've got something in your spirit. Maybe right now you're facing a battle, you're facing a fight, and it can seem an end. And I want to encourage you to be up for the fight, to understand what it's going to cost you, and to see it through and to fight for the finish. And with that in mind, I'd love you to turn to Ephesians chapter 6, verse 10. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 10. Listen to what the word